I think he needs to get his ass in the film room and spend as much time in there as possible. And less time in the car and more time in the film room.
Tom Brady has finally broken his silence, pointing to the real reason NFL players can't stand Shedeur Sanders. What no one expected, however, was Shedeur's fiery response, a move so reckless it might just destroy his career. This is how it all unfolded. The draft day disaster. Picture this. You're projected to be one of the top 5 quarterbacks selected in the NFL draft. You've thrown for over 14,000 yards and 134 touchdowns across your college career, maintaining a stellar 71.8% completion rate. You're the son of a Pro Football Hall of Famer. You've been mentored by the greatest quarterback of all time, and mock drafts have you going as early as the 2nd overall pick. Then draft day arrives and something unprecedented happens. You don't get selected in the 1st round, or the 2nd, or the 3rd, or even the 4th. That's exactly what happened to Shedeur Sanders in the 2025 NFL Draft, sparking one of the most controversial slides in recent memory. But here's where it gets explosive. According to multiple sources, including Tom Brady, the problem wasn't Sanders' stats. His numbers were elite. The real issue was off the field. Missed meetings, questionable professionalism, reckless spending, and constant controversy. And that's exactly why players across the league began to resent him, seeing arrogance where there should have been humility. The most damning example came from his pre-draft interviews. Former NFL quarterback and Fox Sports analyst Brady described Sanders' pre-draft interview process as an absolute disaster, alleging that Sanders wore headphones during meetings, answered FaceTime calls, and appeared completely unprepared for what should have been the most important job interviews of his life.
Anybody know my son, understand he's a professional. Like, he's gonna go into a meeting with headphones on. Like, y'all come on, man.
Deion Sanders' passionate defense of his son showed how deeply he believed the NFL was unfairly targeting Shedeur. To him, this wasn't just criticism, it was a smear campaign. But scouts and executives already had plenty of concerns. Reports say Sanders skipped production meetings with media outlets, including one with former NFL player Ross Tucker before a Colorado State game. He cited injury treatment as an excuse, but gave no real explanation, a pattern that many interpreted as a lack of respect for professional obligations. Then came the incident that really stuck. Sanders was later spotted sitting in a pickup truck instead of attending a rescheduled meeting. To evaluators, it wasn't just a missed appointment. It was a symbol of indifference toward the very process that would define his career. For executives already skeptical of his attitude, it reinforced perceptions of arrogance and entitlement. And questions about his priorities had surfaced even earlier. In September 2023, during an episode of Tom Brady's Let's Go podcast, Deion jokingly asked if a college kid like Shedeur needed a Rolls Royce with all his NIL money. Brady didn't hesitate. His response, half joking but sharp, made it clear where he thought Shedeur's focus should be.
Tom, do you think a college kid needs a Phantom? Like a roll cut?
I think he needs to get his ass in the film room and spend as much time in there as possible. And less time in the car and more time in the film room.
What seemed like lighthearted mentor advice at the time would later be weaponized by critics as evidence that even Brady, Sanders' biggest supporter, had concerns about his priorities and work ethic. But Brady's concerns about Sanders' priorities weren't unfounded. The young quarterback's spending habits had become legendary among college football circles, and not necessarily in a good way. Sanders' substantial NIL earnings, reportedly around $6.5 million, had allowed him to live a lifestyle that most college athletes could only dream of. The problem wasn't that he had money, it was how he chose to display that wealth. The luxury car collection alone was staggering. Sanders reportedly owned a Tesla Cyberbeast, Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, Dodge Durango SRT Hellcat, and Mercedes EQB, among others. But it was the rumors about an even more expensive purchase that really caught the attention of NFL scouts and executives. In May 2025, just after being drafted by the Cleveland Browns, a viral video appeared to show a custom olive green Rolls-Royce Phantom worth over $500,000 being delivered to the Sanders family estate. While the Sanders family later clarified that the car wasn't actually Shedeur's purchase, the initial perception damage was done. Critics pointed to the incident as further evidence of Sanders' reckless spending and misplaced priorities, but the luxury cars were just the tip of the iceberg. Sanders was also known for his expensive jewelry collection, including watches that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His post-draft party featured Louis Vuitton bags filled with cash, creating optics that seemed tone-deaf given his draft slide and the criticism he had already faced about his attitude. When Tom Brady, someone who had achieved the pinnacle of success through relentless dedication and sacrifice, suggested that Sanders needed to spend more time in the film room and less time with his cars, it wasn't just casual advice. It was a warning about misplaced priorities that was proving to be prophetic. The off-field issues weren't limited to spending habits and lifestyle choices. In June 2025, just weeks after being drafted by the Browns, Sanders was cited twice for speeding violations violations in Ohio. The first citation was for driving 91 miles per hour in a 65 miles per hour zone, while the second was even more egregious. He was reportedly clocked at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. These weren't just minor traffic infractions. They were examples of the kind of reckless decision-making that NFL teams desperately try to avoid in their players. Deion Sanders, typically one of the most media-savvy figures in sports, seemed caught off guard by the intensity of the negative coverage his son was receiving. His attempts to defend Shedeur and set the record straight often seemed to backfire, with critics using his very involvement as evidence of the circus that would supposedly follow Sanders to whatever team drafted him.
When you sit up there and say something like, he went in a meeting unprepared, like, dude, Shedeur Sanders, who's had 6 different coordinators, who has still functioned and leveled up every time we brought somebody new in, and you're gonna tell me you're gonna tell me he had on headphones?
The elder Sanders had good reason to be frustrated. The allegations against his son seemed to fly in the face of everything that could be objectively observed about Shedeur's character and work ethic. This was a quarterback who had successfully adapted to 6 different offensive coordinators during his college career, demonstrating both intelligence and flexibility. He had maintained excellent academic standards while carrying the enormous pressure of being a starting quarterback at major college programs. But the damage was already done. By the time draft day arrived, a narrative had been established that Sanders was a problematic prospect whose off-field issues outweighed his on-field accomplishments. This narrative was so pervasive, so well coordinated, and so uniformly accepted across different NFL organizations that it began to seem less like legitimate scouting and more like something else entirely. The draft itself unfolded like a masterclass in institutional power and control. Team after team that desperately needed quarterback help passed on Sanders, often selecting players at other positions or quarterbacks with less impressive college resumes. The message being sent was clear. Talent and production were secondary to attitude and cultural fit, as defined by the league's power brokers. The Las Vegas Raiders' decision was perhaps the most shocking of all. Here was a team with Tom Brady as a minority owner, someone who had personally mentored Sanders and understood his potential better than anyone. Yet they passed on him 8 times across their various draft picks, including 3 key opportunities that would have made perfect sense from a team-building perspective. Brady's response to questions about the Raiders' decision was telling, defensive, frustrated, and almost too emphatic. His denial of involvement felt less like clarity and more like an attempt to distance himself from a decision he knew was wrong but couldn't stop. Meanwhile, the growing resentment from players and executives set the stage for one of the most explosive controversies in recent NFL history, complete with allegations of collusion, bias, and institutional manipulation. The allegations. The whispers that had been circulating throughout the draft process suddenly became roars of outrage when Hall of Fame running back Eric Dickerson made an appearance on AM 570 LA Sports Radio that would send shockwaves through the NFL community. What Dickerson alleged was so explosive, so damaging to the integrity of the league, that it immediately became the story that overshadowed even the draft itself.
And I'll tell you this much here, what I heard from someone that's in the NFL, that the NFL told other, don't draft him. Do not draft him. We're gonna make an example out of him. And this came from a very good source, And he said that, I won't say who, somebody called the Cleveland Browns and said, don't do that.
The implications of Dickerson's allegations were staggering. If true, it would mean that the NFL had engaged in what could only be described as collusion, a coordinated effort among teams to artificially suppress Sanders' draft stock, not based on football ability, but as a form of punishment for what they perceived as disrespectful behavior from him and his father. But Dickerson wasn't finished. He went even further, suggesting that Sanders wasn't even supposed to be drafted at all, that the plan was to leave him completely undrafted as an ultimate humiliation. According to Dickerson, it was only because someone, he wouldn't say who, made a last-minute call to the Cleveland Browns that Sanders was selected at all.
They weren't going to draft him. Because when I saw it, when he went to the second round, I said, I said it out loud. They're not going to draft him. They're going to make an example out of him.
The gravity of these accusations cannot be overstated. If Dickerson's source was accurate, it would represent one of the most serious violations of competitive integrity in NFL history. The idea that league executives would coordinate to punish a player not for anything he had done wrong, but simply because they didn't like his attitude or his father's approach would be a scandal of massive proportions. Dickerson's allegations were given additional weight by his own credibility within the NFL community. As a Hall of Fame player who held the single-season rushing record for decades, Dickerson wasn't some fringe figure making wild accusations. He was a respected former player with deep connections throughout the league, someone who would presumably have access to legitimate insider information. The response to Dickerson's allegations was swift and divided. Supporters of Sanders and his family saw it as confirmation of what they had suspected all along, that the draft slide was about more than football. Critics, however, questioned whether Dickerson's unnamed source could be trusted and whether he might be jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. But Dickerson's wasn't the only voice raising concerns about potential bias in Sanders' treatment. ESPN analyst Stephen A. Smith, who had covered the draft extensively, made his own explosive comments about what he believed had transpired.
I know of owners who went to their personnel in the draft room. You're not drafting him. That's what I was told. And I've been a reporter for 30 years. That's what I was told.
Smith's comments, delivered during an episode of ESPN's First Take, added another layer of credibility to the allegations. Like Dickerson, Smith was a respected media figure with deep sources throughout the NFL. His claim that owners had actively instructed their personnel not to draft Sanders suggested that the alleged collusion might have reached the very highest levels of NFL organizations. The pattern that was emerging was deeply troubling. Multiple credible sources were suggesting that Sanders' draft slide wasn't the result of legitimate football concerns, but rather a coordinated effort to punish him and his family for their perceived transgressions against NFL culture and protocol. But what exactly were those transgressions? To understand the full scope of the allegations, it's necessary to examine the specific behaviors and attitudes that apparently made Sanders and his father such targets for NFL ire. The first major issue was Deion Sanders' approach to the draft process itself. Unlike most parents of NFL prospects, who typically maintain a low profile and allow agents and team officials to handle negotiations, Deion was front and center throughout the entire process. He had publicly predicted that his son would be a top 5 pick, had suggested that certain teams might not be suitable destinations, and had generally conducted himself as if he had a significant say in where his son would end up. This approach apparently rankled NFL executives who were accustomed to dealing with prospects who showed deference and gratitude for any opportunity. The suggestion that the Sanders family might pull an Eli Manning, referring to Manning's successful effort to force a trade away from San Diego immediately after being drafted, was seen by some as presumptuous and disrespectful. The second major issue was Shedeur Sanders' own behavior during the pre-draft process. Reports surfaced of poor interview performances, with one coach describing Sanders' formal interview as the worst he had ever experienced. There were allegations that Sanders had been unprepared, unprofessional, and entitled in his interactions with team officials. Perhaps most damaging were claims that Sanders had deliberately sandbagged interviews with teams he wasn't interested in joining, essentially going through the motions without genuine engagement. If true, this would represent a fundamental misunderstanding of how the NFL draft process works. Prospects don't get to choose their destinations, and showing disrespect to any team is typically seen as showing disrespect to the league as a whole. The third major issue was the broader cultural clash between the Sanders family's approach and traditional NFL values. The NFL has always prided itself on being a meritocracy where hard work, humility, and team-first attitudes are rewarded. The Sanders family's flashy, confident, media-savvy approach was seen by some as antithetical to these values. This cultural clash was exemplified by Shedeur's lifestyle and public persona. His substantial NIL earnings had allowed him to live luxuriously while still in college, complete with expensive cars, designer clothes, and a general level of material comfort that most NFL prospects simply don't have access to. While this wasn't necessarily wrong, it apparently created a perception among some NFL executives that Sanders might not have the hunger and desperation that typically drives success at the professional level. The irony, of course, was that many of these same executives had no problem with wealthy prospects from other backgrounds. Players from privileged families, or those who had earned substantial money through other means, weren't typically subjected to the same scrutiny. The difference, according to critics, was that Sanders was a confident young black man from a confident black family, and that his particular brand of swagger and self-assurance made some people uncomfortable in ways they might not have been willing to acknowledge publicly. This racial component of the controversy added another layer of complexity to an already explosive situation. Some commentators, including former Congressman Jamal Bowman, argued that Sanders' slide reflected broader biases within the NFL, suggesting that the league was uncomfortable with strong black men who refused to conform to traditional expectations of humility and deference. The allegations reached a fever pitch when Dr. Umar Johnson, a prominent social commentator, called for Deion Sanders to sue the NFL for $40 million, alleging racial discrimination and collusion. Johnson's call for legal action represented the most aggressive response to the allegations, suggesting that the Sanders family had grounds for a major lawsuit against the league. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire controversy was the response from Tom Brady himself. Remember, Brady had been mentoring Sanders for years and was a minority owner of the Raiders, one of the teams that passed on Sanders multiple times. When questions arose about his potential role in Sanders' slide, Brady was quick to distance himself from any decision-making.
We're talking about going late in the draft. Elephant in the room, Shedeur Sanders. What happened, Tom? Why did he go so late in the draft?
I mean, it's a good question. I wasn't a part of any evaluation process or to
Skip Bayless
see
says
that.
otherwise.
No.
Brady's vehement denial of involvement was notable for several reasons. First, it contradicted earlier reports that he would have a huge voice in the Raiders' quarterback decisions. Second, his obvious frustration with media speculation suggested that the allegations had hit a nerve. And third, his immediate pivot to reaching out to Sanders with encouragement suggested that he recognized the injustice of what had occurred.
I actually texted Shedeur because I know him very well. And I said, dude, like whatever happens, wherever you go, like that's your first day. Day 2 matters more than the draft.
Brady's response to Sanders after the draft was telling in its empathy and understanding. As someone who had experienced his own draft slide, falling to the 199th overall pick in 2000, Brady understood better than most what Sanders was going through. His message of encouragement and his emphasis on using the slightest motivation demonstrated both his character and his genuine care for the young quarterback. The aftermath. The dust had barely settled on Shedeur Sanders' shocking 5th-round selection when the true magnitude of what had transpired began to emerge. What started as whispers and allegations soon crystallized into a damning indictment of how the NFL's old guard had systematically worked to humble a young quarterback whose only crime appeared to be confidence in his own abilities and pride in his family's legacy. The immediate aftermath of the draft revealed the human cost of what had occurred. Deion Sanders, typically one of the most composed and confident figures in sports media, was reportedly devastated by what had happened to his son. Stephen A. Smith, who had developed a relationship with the Sanders family through his coverage of college football, provided a rare glimpse into the personal toll the draft slide had taken.
Deion, as I told y'all, was devastated. When I came on the airwaves and talked about how devastated he was, and Molly knows this, I had not spoken to him at the time. I've spoken to him since because he called me to thank me for being accurate on what I was saying about the level of devastation that he had felt.
This wasn't just professional disappointment. This was a father watching his son's dreams be manipulated and diminished by forces beyond their control. The pain was compounded by the knowledge that Shedeur's college production had been exceptional by any measure. But perhaps even more revealing was the response from Shedeur Sanders himself. Rather than showing bitterness or defeat, the young quarterback demonstrated a maturity and resilience that belied the entitled narrative that had been constructed around him. His response to being selected in the 5th round was gracious and determined, focusing on the opportunity ahead rather than dwelling on the perceived injustices of the past. The more troubling aspects of the controversy continued to unfold in the weeks following the draft. Additional sources began coming forward to corroborate the allegations of coordinated action against Sanders, painting a picture of an NFL establishment that was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make an example of a player who had challenged their traditional power structures. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came in the form of the specific teams that had passed on Sanders. The Las Vegas Raiders, despite Tom Brady's minority ownership and his relationship with Sanders, passed on him not once, but 8 times across their various draft picks. This was particularly notable given that the Raiders desperately needed quarterback help and had previously been linked to Sanders in multiple mock drafts. The New York Giants' decision was equally suspect. Despite needing a quarterback and having conducted extensive interviews with Sanders, they ultimately selected Jackson Dart instead, a player with less impressive college production and similar questions about NFL readiness. The fact that the the Giants' interview with Sanders was later described as particularly contentious, raised questions about whether the team had already made up its mind before he even walked in the room. Even more revealing was the pattern of anonymous criticism that had emerged during the pre-draft process. Multiple reports from unnamed sources described Sanders as brash, arrogant, and unprepared, but none of these sources were willing to put their names behind these assessments. This anonymity allowed for character assassination without accountability, creating a narrative that became self-reinforcing as more and more teams began to question Sanders' character based on secondhand reports. The defense of Sanders came from some unexpected quarters. Michael Strahan, the former Giants star and current television host, was particularly vocal in his criticism of the anonymous sources who had attacked Sanders' character. Michael Strahan, who watched the draft with Tom Brady, called out anonymous sources for unfairly targeting Sanders, arguing that his production should have outweighed subjective character concerns. Strahan's defense was particularly significant because of his own background. As a former NFL player who had transitioned successfully into media, Strahan understood both the football and business aspects of what had occurred. His willingness to publicly defend Sanders against anonymous critics added credibility to the argument that Sanders had been treated unfairly. The racial component of the controversy also continued to gain attention. Several prominent black voices in sports media and social activism pointed out the stark contrast between how Sanders was being treated and how similar behavior from white prospects had been received in the past. The comparison to Eli Manning was particularly apt. Manning's family had successfully orchestrated his trade away from San Diego after being drafted, yet he was never subjected to the kind of character assassination that Sanders experienced. This double standard extended to the broader cultural expectations placed on Sanders. His confidence and swagger, traits that would likely be celebrated in a white quarterback as leadership and competitive fire, were instead characterized as arrogance and entitlement. His family's success and wealth, rather than being seen as advantages that could help him succeed in the NFL, were instead viewed as potential liabilities that might make him soft or hungry. The most explosive revelation came from former NFL quarterback Cam Newton, who provided a detailed analysis of Sanders' situation during his podcast. Newton, who had faced similar scrutiny during his own career for his confident demeanor and unique style, offered a perspective that cut to the heart of what was really happening. Newton's analysis went beyond just the draft controversy to examine how Sanders was being treated during his early days with the Cleveland Browns. Even after being drafted, Sanders was facing an uphill battle, competing against not just other quarterbacks, but against a narrative that had already been established about his character and work ethic. The Browns' decision to keep 4 quarterbacks on their roster, with Sanders ranked 4th behind Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, and 3rd-round pick Dylan Gabriel, seemed to confirm that they viewed him more as a long-term project than as someone who could contribute immediately. This despite Sanders' superior college production compared to Gabriel and his greater upside compared to the aging veterans ahead of him on the depth chart. Newton's point about the disparity in protection and opportunity was particularly telling. During preseason games, Sanders was often playing behind backup offensive linemen who were later cut from the team, while other quarterbacks received more favorable circumstances for their evaluations. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy where Sanders' struggles could be attributed to his individual failings rather than the difficult situations he was placed in. Moreover, the Sanders controversy highlights the ongoing tensions within the NFL between traditional power structures and changing cultural norms. The league has long prided itself on being a meritocracy where performance on the field is the ultimate arbiter of success. But the Sanders case suggests that other factors, family connections, cultural background, personal demeanor, and willingness to conform to established hierarchies, may play a larger role in determining opportunities than the league would like to admit. Tom Brady's role throughout this entire saga has been particularly complex and revealing. As someone who had experienced his own draft slide and used it as motivation to achieve unprecedented success, Brady understood better than most what Sanders was going through. His immediate outreach to Sanders after the draft, encouraging him to use the slightest fuel for future success, demonstrated both his character and his recognition that an injustice had occurred. But Brady's position as a minority owner of the Raiders, one of the teams that passed on Sanders multiple times despite their need at quarterback, also raises uncomfortable questions about the power dynamics within NFL organizations. Even if Brady wasn't directly involved in the decision-making process, as he claimed, his inability to advocate successfully for Sanders suggests that even the greatest quarterback in NFL history has limitations when it comes to challenging entrenched organizational thinking. The long-term consequences of the Sanders controversy are still unfolding. The young quarterback now faces the enormous challenge of proving himself worthy of an opportunity that should have been his from the beginning. Every mistake he makes will be scrutinized as evidence that the teams that passed on him were right to do so. Every success he achieves will be qualified by questions about whether he could have accomplished even more if he had been given a fair chance from the start. As Shedeur Sanders continues his journey with the Cleveland Browns, words. He carries with him not just his own dreams and ambitions, but the weight of a controversy that has exposed some of the NFL's deepest contradictions and prejudices. His success or failure will be watched closely, not just as a measure of his individual abilities, but as a test of whether talent and determination can ultimately overcome institutional bias and coordinated opposition. Whether Sanders will be able to overcome these obstacles and achieve the success that his college career suggested he was capable of remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, his journey will continue to be one of the most closely watched and controversial storylines in the NFL for years to come. Found this information exciting and unbelievable? Be sure to check out other similar and amazing videos on the screen. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.